Well, our guy Leaf Tulane had boots on the ground at the NBA Draft Combine last week. Which college stars boosted their stock ahead of the draft in June? We're going to talk about it on today's Locked On College Basketball.
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, folks? Happy Wednesday and welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, a daily national college hoop show, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Andy Patton, joined today by our regular guest, Leaf Tulane, who's also hosting the Locked On NBA Big Board show right now. Leaf was on the ground at the NBA Draft Combine last week. Looking forward to get an opportunity to talk to Leaf here about the RISERS from the Combine, the college stars who boosted their stock, maybe some guys who maybe didn't help their stock as much as they'd have liked to at the Combine. We're also going to talk a little bit about Bronny James and the situation going on with him. And then we're going to close out the show with another draft profile. A couple of weeks ago, Leaf and I talked about Ryan Dunn from Virginia. Today, we're going to talk about Baylor Scheierman, one of those RISERS who has really put together a quality couple of weeks and has put himself squarely in the conversation as a first-round pick. We're going to close out the show talking about him. But Leaf, let's just get straight into it. After a week at the Combine, watching these guys, who are some of the players, the college stars in particular, who you felt did the most to boost their draft stock ahead of the draft about a month or so from now?
You know what's crazy is I feel like we're going to talk about players we talked about all season, and so we knew they were good, but NBA draft evaluators may have had questions. So that would be Zach Edey and Stephon Castle, and they did it for different reasons. Zach Edey, not that it matters enormously, shot the ball well. He demonstrated touch in a day where everyone's asking people to be able to shoot, whether it's free throws, mid-range jump shots, threes. Edey did that well. But what really moved the needle for him is, yes, he tested enormously. Everyone knew he would. But his agility, he won agility drills over guys like Alex Sarr, who's the most likely to be number one pick, who's touted to be a versatile, switchable defender. So what does that mean? He's a big guy with agility. Well, Edey had better agility. His three-quarter court sprint was better than that of Donovan Clingan and of Alex Sarr. He shot the ball well. And so now is his win like as large of a leap as some other players we'll get to later? Maybe not. Who knows? But maybe it is, because his draft range, depending the evaluator, like I talked to a Sun scout and we asked him, okay, is Edey a lottery guy? Like some mocks have, or is he kind of where a lot of boards have him in the mid-20s? And he goes, I could see it just because he's different and people like to zig when everyone's zagging or vice versa. And so I think he's a big winner, both literally and figuratively. And he looked the part. Like when he was moving through those drills, you could hear him moving, and like it looked like other people were kind of coasting, and he was really working hard in his craft. And I thought of the big guys he trained with, it was Kel'el Ware, Donovan Clingan, Alex Sarr, Ryan Dunn, and I'm missing one, but that was the group. And he looked like he had the best workout of this quintet that was working out there. And then came the power forwards, and his numbers stood the test for a while until some absolute freak athletes beat him. And that showed how good of an athlete Zach Edey is, not just a kind of the lumbering oaf that he gets labeled as occasionally by people who don't really watch.
Yeah, I want to stick on Edey for a second, because I think when you just look at projectable NBA like skill set and role, like people want to focus on the ceiling, and they're like, oh, Edey's ceiling is capped because how much is he going to be able to do? You're going to have to play drop coverage defensively, et cetera, et cetera. But people don't really focus on the floor. And in a draft where I feel like a lot of the bigs have questions, like Donovan Clingan is a fairly complete big man prospect, more so than most, but he's still got his concerns. You mentioned Sarr having a few concerns, especially after not testing as well as maybe people thought that he would. And, Filipowski has his concerns, Ware has his concerns, and Edey, like, it's easy to focus on the flaws, but you look at the positives, like he's going to score in the NBA. Like not in the traditional way that modern NBA offenses are running their systems. And, they're not going to pound the ball to him every possession like they did in college, because that's just not how the NBA works. But there's no doubt that Zach Edey can score at the next level. And he's got really good touch from the free throw line, and the ability to potentially expand that shot a little bit, I think, is there. And I think that people it's so easy to focus on the negatives with Zach Edey. And I don't think enough people are focusing on the positives. And I was happy to see him put together a strong performance at the Combine, because I think you're right. There are some scouts who are like, oh, hey, like Phoenix at 22, like I know they have Yusuf Nurkic and he's somewhat similar, but like if he's around there, or if he's around for Milwaukee, I think they're at 23, like teams like that, I got to give him a look right there, because he's got an immediately bankable skill coming into the league.
And that's a big thing is how many teams can say confidently in this draft, which is mostly devoid of stars, or at least I believe it to be,
Mhm.
at least at the top. There may be someone in the middle that you find, and it's just an absolute hidden gem. But the productivity of Zach Edey is just at a track record you don't see. Yes, it may
Mhm.
not translate the exact same way. You may not go to the jump hook as often because it's
Mhm.
not an efficient shot. But Purdue didn't run pick and roll. Braden Smith would hold the ball and it would be like a pick and like kind of bury someone. If Zach Edey runs pick and roll and you have a lob threat or
Mhm.
have him roll instead of just kind of sliding into a post up, that opens up something that is an NBA thing that happens all the time. Almost every possession, there's some sort of pick and roll. And now you have a guy who should be excellent at it, just wasn't asked to do it because his guards weren't very good at pick and roll. His guards
Mhm.
were more hold the ball, step out, entry pass, or swing to the wing so they could enter. And I think that is an immediate NBA attribute. Like he's going to be a good pick and roll player as long as he can get into his roles. And I asked the scout specifically that. I said, "Do you think the reason that they didn't run pick and roll is because that he couldn't, or because the guards couldn't?" And
Mhm.
I said my belief was that the guards couldn't. And he goes, "Yeah, I think Edie's going to be a force in pick and roll in the NBA." So there is optimism about that.
You mentioned Castle too, and I want to hear a little bit more about that. Obviously, a guy who again, the conversation, the narrative around him is often what he can't do, which is mostly the outside shooting, but the length, the athleticism, everything else in his profile. I know he wants to play point guard, and I'm curious if you think that will impact how teams perceive him in the draft. But if he's capable of being a jumbo-sized point guard who's elite defensively and can develop an offensive game, he feels like a potential winner in this class as well.
Yeah, the reason I think he's a big winner from the combine is not because he played and he shot well. Like
Mhm.
everyone saw the numbers. He went 18 to 25. They weren't game speed shots, so
Sure.
it doesn't mean like, oh my gosh, that guy's an unbelievable shooter. But it does show the capacity to put the ball in the hoop. Whereas a couple guys that we'll talk about later, and even more from the G
Mhm.
League, so I don't ruin the surprise. But
Mhm.
like Ron Holland, Matas Buzelis, Cody Williams, those guys really struggle to make the shots.
Yeah.
And I know it's a small sample size of 25, but they did a couple drills. Like you shoot 75 threes, eventually the truth comes out. And
Mhm.
Stephon Castle shot the best of those guys, and he was kind of on the outskirts looking in of people that you thought could shoot. Like Cody Williams shot 42% on low volume. Well, Stephon Castle was low volume and shot 27%.
Mhm.
So his shot better than 27%. Cody Williams shot worse than 42. There's truth to that.
Right.
Uh, the other thing is Castle measured really well.
Yeah.
And you have these concerns of like, oh, is he just listed as a 6'6" guard? Well, he basically is 6'6" without shoes, about 6'7" with shoes on. And then if he's playing point guard, that may not mean his floor is as high, but it moves his ceiling upward.
Mhm.
It says, yeah, if he can develop into a full-time point guard who runs pick and roll, and the only reason he didn't is because they had an All-American point guard already there, and he didn't want to step on toes, and he just
Mhm.
wanted to coexist and thrive in a role that was already preset by Andre Jackson last year. Like that to me is actually a positive. It just means
Mhm.
there's going to be growing pains, but the ceiling is certainly higher than if he was a two guard who didn't shoot particularly well. So I think Stephon Castle, just by measuring well and having a small sample size of shooting well, has proven a lot of doubters wrong and alleviated concerns of like, oh, if he's a two guard who can't shoot, what are we getting? And now you could maybe get a point guard that's not a true like facilitator, but he's
Mhm.
someone who can help you facilitate. And you have another dude who helps you score more, but he'll be that kind of rugged guard. And I've heard him compared even to like Jimmy Butler. And I'm
Mhm.
not saying like prime Jimmy Butler, but like some of the younger Jimmy Butler, where defensively he was a monster and he could help you score, and he's grown as a facilitator.
Couple bigs that I know you talked about on the Big Board podcast, and that I thought stood out as well, that I kind of wanted to mention or get your thoughts on, were Adem Bona from UCLA and Yves Missi from Baylor, guys who tested well. Who I know Missi in particular is really raw, but the upside seems extremely high. And Bona coming off of just not being on a good UCLA team last year, and I think that hurt his stock just because the team just really underperformed, especially offensively. But two guys who kind of stood out to me. There's a couple other mid-major bigs that I really liked as well. Jonathan Mobo at San Francisco looks good. Enrique Freeman goes from Portsmouth to the G League Combine to the NBA Draft Combine and kind of performs well at all those stops. But were those bigs kind of guys who stood out to you? Or there maybe any other bigs or players that stood out as well?
Yves Missi, he didn't play in the scrimmages, so I kind of forgotten how much I loved what I saw. But he had a 38.5-inch vertical,
Mm-hmm.
ran like a deer, and then he shot the ball lights out as the drills happened. Like I know that's not going to be his archetype, but the
Sure.
touch was there. And we talked about this. I think it might have been Isaac and I at one point, but I
Mm-hmm.
talked about how Yves Missi was the type of guy that if Scott Drew gave him a chance to say, hey, you can do this, he could always take it and run with it. Like there was a couple times where he put the ball between his legs and spun, and sometimes good would happen, sometimes bad would happen, but the skill set was on a display. So he definitely moved his stock up. I think he's going to be a lottery pick. And then Adem Bona, I think, might have had the biggest jump of anyone. He may have started lower, and that's why I started with Edey, just because I thought he would end up being picked higher. But Adem Bona had a 40.5-inch vertical, and it might have even been low because the guy just like seemed to jump higher later, played in the scrimmages, dominated defensively, and then the shell drill, like 4-on-4 shells, which they ran, he bossed everything. Every shot would get a finger on. On offense, he'd catch it and dunk everything. And he also shot well in the drills. So I think Bona's worked his way into being a first-round pick despite being an undersized center. He makes up for his athleticism and fluidity. And if he can knock down mid-range jump shots or free throws at a decent rate, that's just cake, because that's not what you're asking for a defensively minded energy center. And this is going to get me in some hot water, but I had this discussion. I think Adem Bona is a better center prospect or even a forward prospect than Deron Holmes, even though he shoots significantly better. And he was a second-team All-American. I'm well aware. I saw him in person at March Madness. But Holmes doesn't change end of the floor. Bona runs like a deer, protects the rim better at the NBA level, where it's athleticism oriented rather than kind of the positioning that you can get away with at Dayton. And I think that Adem Bona is going to be like an energy big for years, whereas Deron Holmes is going to have to find the absolute perfect fit to utilize his intangibles, his smarts, and his shooting to make him a better player. But I see a lot of people having the top 15, especially from people I respect and I enjoy talking to. But I'm personally out on him, and I think Adem Bona is like the complete opposite player, but I think his stock has risen enough to the point where I feel confident in that assessment.
We mentioned Deron Holmes as a potential faller, or at least a guy you're not as high on. I want to kind of get into that portion of the conversation too. Some guys who maybe didn't boost their stock or maybe even lowered their stock, or just some guys who maybe have some tough decisions to make now, as we're about a week out from the decision deadline in order for players to come back to college next year. So we're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk about Bronny James. Got to have a conversation about Bronny James, what he looked like, what your thoughts were, this whole media circus that has followed him around because of his relationship with his dad. We're going to talk about all of that in just a second. Right after I tell you about today's sponsor, eBay Motors. Folks, passion, drive, patience, that's the winning formula for winning championships, and it's also what helps keep your ride or die alive. And eBay Motors has everything that you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers to roof racks, exhaust kits to LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. Plus, with over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your car every time, or you get your money back, because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. So with all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home that W. So keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply, and eBay's Guaranteed Fit is only available to U.S. customers. All right, Leaf, moving on to talk about guys who maybe didn't raise their stock the way that guys like Zach Edey did and some of those other guys. And I want to talk about a few of the lottery options, guys who maybe were a little concerned about how the testing went for them, the measurements, all that stuff. But I do want to start with the Bronny James of it all, because that has been the biggest storyline at the combine. He got the invite, which was already controversial for some people. A player who averaged less than 5 points per game, was not particularly efficient at USC. I think you see kind of the extreme viewpoints. Some people think it's an outrage that he got invited, that he's getting any attention at all. He shouldn't be in this conversation. Some people will acknowledge that he had a cardiac arrest and he came back in the middle of the season on a team that was already very bad, that already had a lead guard in Isaiah Collier. Then he got hurt, and there was just a lot of kind of chaos that may have led to Bronny's season not going the way that it could have. But all in all, Bronny was a polarizing topic based on the measurements, based on the performances and the drills and everything. What did you kind of make of what the Bronny James experience was at this combine?
Yeah, his performance, I would say overall, was better than I kind of anticipated. Not because I didn't know what he was going to do coming in, but I felt like he belonged on the court.
Yeah.
Even as a freshman, more than you'd anticipate, because even some of the more touted freshmen that have fallen in boards typically don't play, but if they do, they look a little more lost compared to the veterans. At least he looked like he was a heady player, knowing where to be, when to shoot, who to pass to. And there were some turnovers. The shooting comes and goes. 4 of 10 in the last day, 13 points. I thought the shot looked solid in the drills. athleticism was on display. He had a 40.5-inch vertical.
Mm-hmm.
To me, what he looked like was like a big cornerback almost. Like he looked 6'1", nearly 200 pounds, or maybe like a smaller safety. He kind of had a football build more than a basketball build to me. And that's where what's going to hurt him is the lack of length. Like his arms are a little longer, but like I'm just saying in terms of height, the length is lacking. And then, yes, there's going to be a ton of scrutiny about him because his lack of production. Like you said, USC, not a great place to step in midseason. Even if they were a good team, it just wasn't a good fit. But I would say if he were not named LeBron James Jr. and he had the performance in the combine, I would say based on his seasonal stats, you would say it was a success of a combine. It's just because there's that excess scrutiny. So I don't think he really moved the needle up or down, honestly. Like I thought he shot the ball. And if he moved it, I would say it was slightly positive because he shot the ball pretty decently, made the right plays, and showed he has the ability defensively to slide his feet. But I think he'd have to commit to being more of the ilk of Davion Mitchell than he does the possibility of playing like an off-ball shooting guard. He's more of a I'm going to control the tempo of a game, but with my defense type of point guard, and those have varying levels of success. There's really not that many that can do it at that level, and so that's where my skepticism comes from, not from his performance at the combine.
Yeah, I think it was Jonathan Givoni's Draft Express site. There's player comps based on measurements and size and not necessarily skill set, just your height, weight, all that stuff. And the closest comp for Bronny, I think, was Gary Harris. And I can see like the build and the look, but like Gary Harris is a 37% career 3-point shooter. Like he's an off-ball guard who can score in ways that Bronny James just hasn't displayed. And I think you're right. The basketball IQ for Bronny is clearly there, and it's understandable coming from the lineage that he has, and he makes the right reads, and he is a good defensive player. And I think he is strong and stout for his size, and he's still very young. So I think there is more upside to be had. But at the end of the day, like, you either got to be a facilitator, a lead guard type, or you got to be really, really good shooter if you want to be an NBA player at his size. And he just doesn't feel like he's quite in either of those spots. And you know, there can be a lot more conversation of whether it would be better for him to come back to school and try to get a spot, you know, at a school where he can play that lead facilitator guard role, or if he should just go in the G League and try to develop that way. There's a lot of people have a lot of opinions about Bronny James and what he should do in that regard. But I think ultimately what gets lost is like he didn't look bad at the combine, and he's not a bad basketball player. He just wasn't in a great situation at college and is now just facing scrutiny levels that are undeserving of a player who just wants the ball and has the talent to be pretty good and isn't getting recognized for that just because of the circus that follows him around.
Yeah, no, I think that's well put. And LeBron James walked in. Like he walked in, and I think that almost made it more apparent, like, oh, we got to scout him now. Like, and I don't know if that helps or not. Like, he played fine. Like I said, 4-10 shooting, 13 points. It's not the craziest numbers, but like he belonged. But you just have to focus on him because LeBron's there. And when he walked in, I quite literally looked to my left and I go, oh my God, that's LeBron James. and Richard sitting next to me goes, stop it. And then I was like, no, seriously, that's LeBron James. And then like we just kind of were like in shut and awe. And I think there was a lot of people like that. Even like seasoned scouts were like, oh, LeBron's here, we should watch Bronny. And I don't know if that actually helped him.
I want to talk about a couple lottery guys that some one and done potential guys who maybe didn't do as well as we would have hoped at the combine from a measurement perspective. I think that the big storyline is the big storyline for a one and done guard that's not Bronny James, I should say, is Rob Dillingham. Dillingham he didn't measure well, and we didn't expect him to, and he didn't do any scrimmages because of the injuries, because he was a little banged up. But basically there's nobody in the league who's his size except Trae Young. And Trae Young is like one of the best facilitators and 3-point shooters in the entire league. Dillingham is very small, and he's really talented, obviously. But how concerned are you about the lack of wingspan, the lack of size, the lack of weight that's on him? And how productive does he have to be able to really stick, especially with the conversation around him being still a top 10, potentially even top 5 pick?
I'll take it a step further. He's my number 1 right now.
Wow. All right.
and the reason being is, do I think he's a superstar like Trae Young? No. But if you told me, hey, there's going to be 2 players in this class that score 20 points a game, he's going to be the first one I think of. And yeah, maybe the archetype of Trae Young, even at the, like, if you were to look at Trae Young and you say, okay, can he win a championship as being the best player? You probably say no. And I would say, okay, Trae Young's more talented version of Dillingham. So that doesn't make me think, okay, he's a superstar. But what he does make me think is there's a way he scores 20 points and 7 assists on a team, especially if he goes to the Spurs at 4, for instance. Like that could be a dynamic duo, and he could be the best player to complement Wembanyama. Now, regardless of fit, I think he's the best natural scorer in this class. Like, he knows how to get to his spots, whether he has a pick or whether he's isolating. He can get to a jump shot. He can get to a floater. He can get all the way to the rim. He can step back and shoot threes. He's 50% on catch and shoot threes, 45% on off the dribble threes. It's really, really impressive array of shots that he can take and make. And if you're going to tell me 20 points is what he can score, I believe that more than I believe in anyone else scoring that level. And is it as winning as maybe someone else's 17 with 7 rebounds, 7 assists? Probably not. But it just means I have more belief in what he can do. And I think he's the skill set of like a watered down version of Trae Young, and maybe the effectiveness, the impact of Darius Garland, who's been a one-time All-Star early in his career. I think his game's a little different than Garland, but if you're drafting Darius Garland in this draft and you get an All-Star out of the number 1 pick or wherever he goes, top 7, I think that's a success. I don't think you're drafting an All-Star, you're drafting pieces in this draft. And if you get an All-Star, that's cake. Like, you typically want to draft a home run 1 through 3, and I wouldn't draft him as a home run pick. But maybe you're getting a double. And if you draft a double at 1, that's better than what this class really, like, if you were to do predictive values and analysis, probably what it would indicate.
Yeah. Want to talk briefly on Cody Williams, and then if there was some older college prospects who I think maybe didn't do as much as we would have hoped, and maybe guys who might end up returning to school because of that. But starting with Cody Williams, really small, really skinny, 178 is what he weighed in at. That's been a concern for him. Obviously, the bigger concern with him was just productivity, particularly towards the end of the season. Obviously, he was dealing with some injury stuff at Colorado. What do you kind of make of Cody Williams? Because I've seen him as high as like 7. I've seen him outside the lottery. I've seen him kind of all over the place. And I think he's got what seems to be a significant amount of upside, but it's not hard to see why he's a risky proposition as well.
Yeah, he's falling. I'm pretty sure he's going to fall. And the reason being, at least from what I was able to witness, obviously teams have different access to interviews and workouts than media. But his shot, 42%, looks good. But if you watch him shoot it, there's a reluctancy to shoot it in game. And I know why now. The ball doesn't rotate. Like, he shoots a knuckleball. And so it doesn't come out super quickly. But that does leave me some faith in that, okay, he knows how to make a ball go in the basket. Like, shooting 42% as a freshman, the ability to go to the rim, shoot floaters, make free throws is something. Even if his shot didn't look good there, I think there's enough track record to believe he can do it. But athletically, he didn't test all that great. He was very thin, as you mentioned, and his shot didn't look good. So if you're going to bank on taking him higher, it was going to be skill set related and scoring ability where other people struggled. Like Ron Holland didn't shoot well. Matas Buzelis didn't shoot well. So if Cody Williams shot well, that could shot put him upward. But I think he's going to move downward because he didn't have the athletic attributes of the other guys and shot poorly. Whereas Stephon Castle had the athletic ability and shot better, even though I would still say Cody Williams is a better basketball shooter in game. But those type of things matter in this setting. So I think he is falling. I think he'll probably, the lowest he'll fall is about 12.
A couple maybe second round guys who may have kind of pushed themselves out of that conversation. Maybe a few guys who even could return to school. Jackson Robinson, Coleman Hawkins is a guy in that conversation as well. There's a few other draft prospects, guys like Peyton Stanford and Trey Alexander, who I don't think are coming back to school, but who didn't look all that great in the scrimmages as well. Like, is there anybody kind of who you were disappointed by their performance, or who you think maybe should return to school kind of in that group, who is still kind of on the fence at this point?
Well, I thought Sanford and Robinson really played poorly, and honestly didn't shock me because what they do well is shooting, and if they don't shoot well, they don't really impact the rest of the game. So if they don't shoot well on a given day in a small sample size, it doesn't look good. Also, Peyton Sanford dislocated his shoulder and then came back in and was a shell of himself. He hit like a lefty bang shot, was the only shot I think he hit the whole week. And so, yeah, I would, if I were them, I'd go back to school. But at least you have a lot of track record in Sanford's case of just being a dead sniper. And so, like it doesn't matter that he didn't shoot well for 2 games. There are games where he hit 8 threes in college, and that means something. But I don't think his athletic testing went well. In the case of Robinson, I think you had more hope that, okay, maybe athletically he could really test well and show that he could shoot. So I'd consider going back to school. But the thing about him is maybe he doesn't go back to BYU. Maybe it's Kentucky. And now it just becomes a fishy situation. So I kind of think he's like, I think both are probably going to stay, honestly, is my gut inclination, but I don't think their performances help them. You mentioned Coleman Hawkins, and I think some evaluators didn't like what they saw, but I like for the second straight year, I thought Coleman Hawkins was good. Like, he does what he does well. He plays and he distributes, and sometimes it's herky-jerky, sometimes it doesn't look great, but he gets the ball to the right places and distributes out of the center position. Defensively, he switches, communicates like crazy, gets his hands on the ball, and he shot the ball really well. Last year, he didn't shoot the ball really well, but he impacted the game. This year, he had 17 points in the first half of one of the scrimmages and was the best player on the floor, and then he didn't play much the second half, but it somehow becomes like a negative on Coleman Hawkins. So I thought he played pretty well, and I don't know what the indictment is on.
We're going to close out the show talking about Baylor Scheierman. It's our second NBA draft profile. We're going to focus on the Creighton wing and his stock rising and kind of where we kind of think he's at. We're going to come to that conversation here in just a second. All right, Leaf, closing out the show today with our second NBA draft profile, full segment here on one player. We're picking Baylor Scheierman. As you said to me beforehand when we picked, you've been talking nonstop about Baylor Scheierman, so let's keep it going. Really, really nice performance from Scheierman. It tested well, or tested decently, I should say. Performed well in the scrimmages. Just a guy who just looks like a basketball player. Like he's an eye test guy more than anything else. And I know you've been in on him for quite a while now. What did you see from him, and kind of where are you at with him in terms of where he should go in this draft?
Yeah, well, I made a podcast of, okay, here are two wings that I think should be top 20 picks on January 1st. That was Baylor Scheierman and Jalen Tyson. So for 5 months and 21 days now, I've had both of them in my top 20. I still have both of them in my top 20, but I think it's becoming more mainstream. Baylor Scheierman was the absolute unequivocal number one winner of the NBA Combine. No matter where you went conversing with anyone, everyone asks, okay, like, how high do you have Scheierman? Well, I got to kind of be like, I've had him in my top 15 the whole time, so I haven't moved him. And there was a lot of people who were like, yeah, I had him 45, and now he's a surefire lock to go top 25. Yeah. So I virtually guarantee you guys, and I'm not going to say go out there and bet it, but if you do, and his line's about 25, I would say pick that he'll go prior to that.
Yeah.
Now, as for the basketball stuff, what does he bring to the table? He brings to the table exactly what he brought to Creighton, but in a watered-down role. What he did at Creighton was he scored 19 points, 9 rebounds, had 4.5 assists per game. So what he says, he's a well-rounded, holistic basketball player. What he's going to do in the NBA, knock down threes, rebound his position, compete defensively, and be able to make smart decisions when the ball's in his hands. If he's attacking a closeout, don't expect a bad shot to be taken. He's going to make the right reads. He's going to get you good shots, and he's going to knock down his own shots. And he's just that's like, if you were to ask teams if they're drafting at 25, how fast they'd sign up to get a guy who plays like George Niang but plays the small forward as opposed to like a power forward, and he knocks down 40% of his threes for his career, and he rebounds, and he's a great locker room guy, every team would sign up in a heartbeat. So that's what you're getting right there. Not to mention, I think he's a better passer, and I think he's a better defender for his position. They play differently. So don't think I'm saying he's a small forward that has the feet of Niang. I think he's a little better defensively than Niang. I don't think he's a great defender, but he's positionally aware and he will compete. Now, he rebounds excellently. He shot I think he shot 38.5, 39% from three, and a high volume. What I think matters in the 3-point shooting, if you're to look at one skill that's indicative, it means it's the coach's confidence that you can take him, and that means his and Peyton Sanford volume was the two best in the class, and the third best was Dalton Connect. Those are guys I have the utmost faith in as shooters, more so than even someone like Cody Williams, like I mentioned, who shot 42% of 2 shots, or even a guy like Reed Sheppard, who I think might be the best shooter in the class. But I have more faith in the long term in those guys shooting really, really well at the NBA level, because they won't be bothered by length. They've seen all sorts of defenses and shot 8 threes per game. And back to the point about Scheierman, if you're going to get someone who's going to be a really good communicator defensively, like I watched him, he was the loudest person in the gym. He'd talk, he'd tell you what he's doing. On the bench, all energy. And I know it's played up because they want to show their best foot forward, but it looked authentic. I watched tons of Creighton the last couple of years. I saw him in person play in Denver, and that was last year's March Madness. And he looked the part and all those things. And for the Jazz, I'm wearing this Jazz hat right now. George Niang was a critical locker room guy. When he left, there was people talking all year, be like, man, they miss Niang so much. Now they kind of don't have that locker room guy. And it matters. So you get someone who's a locker room guy who shoots 40% from three, will compete defensively, rebounds, and make passes when he has the ball, maybe even a secondary ball creator. And people have compared him to Joe Ingles, like another Jazz guy. I don't quite see that one as much because Jinglin Joe, as he's known here, he gets to his left hand. He's a pick and roll savant. I don't think Scheierman's quite that. But what he is a competitor, and he's someone who will do his job. And I'd be pretty shocked if he's not taking the top 20.
Yeah, and I think at this point, I mean, we've seen a bit of a shift for NBA general managers, particularly picking in the latter half of the first round. Typically, those teams are playoff teams, and they're starting to realize, like, hey, we should take the older guys, the guys who are going to be productive right away, so we can maximize the value on that rookie contract. You know, if we take an 18-year-old, especially if you're a smaller market team that's competing, taking an 18-year-old makes no sense, because is somebody else going to pay them when they're 22? Like, you want to get the maximum value you can. You've seen like guys like Jaime Jaquez and Brandon Pajemski are recent examples of older. Pajemski, I guess, was only a sophomore, but not one and done guys who were who succeeded in the NBA right away. And Scheierman just feels like such an obvious candidate for that. He's got a day one role in the NBA. He's not going to be a superstar. The ceiling and the floor are fairly close together, but there's nothing wrong with that. And I think you look at the teams picking in that kind of 15 to 25 range. You got Philadelphia, you got Orlando, you got Phoenix, you got Milwaukee. Like, not every team is a perfect fit for him, but pretty much every team could use somebody like that if they don't already have it. And it's hard for me to imagine him falling farther than like you said, 25, because there's just so many teams in that 15 to 20 range who need shooting, who want shooting, who can find a way to fill a player, or to have a player like that fill a role for their team right away.
Yeah, I mean, you're preaching to the choir there. I think the Nuggets are the best example of this. Yeah. Like, that last year, they drafted Christian Brown, and then they took Julian Strother, Tyson, all these guys that are older. And Calvin Booth talked about this in an article I read, and it was basically the CBA means you have to pay players, like your top guys, well, and you have to get people early in contracts in order to fill out your roster, because you need 240 minutes, which is 48 times 5, and which is what the NBA needs. And you need to fill out your roster accordingly. And so you need to draft players that are ready to contribute right away and be able to not have a drop off when you go to your bench unit for competing teams. That was the Nuggets' issue this year. I don't think they played well enough off their bench, and they got enough productivity. Their numbers would say they didn't. Well, more and more teams, small market or big market, because they're all paying the same luxury tax, and the threshold and the curtain, everything is right there under the CBA. So you're going to see more and more veterans taken around 15 through 30. And especially in this class that is devoid of stars, I think they might even rise higher. Like, you're going to see Devin Carter taken higher. You're going to see Dalton Connect in the top 10. Tristan Da Silva is going to hear his name called early. And so Baylor Scheierman, I think, is the winner of the combine. But the times are dictating that he would be picked anyway, even if he hadn't had a great combine, because it's no secret he can shoot the ball. And he basically made everyone aware of that a month earlier.
Leaf Tulane, thanks so much for coming on the show, having your expertise from the NBA Draft Combine. We appreciate it. We're going to have more Combine conversations. Obviously, next week we'll have an opportunity to talk about guys who are making the decision to stay in the draft, to leave the draft, to go back to school. We'll talk about that as well. Thanks again for coming on, folks. You can find Locked On College Basketball wherever you get your podcast. Thanks for being an everyday listener. We appreciate you. We'll be back later this week with more updates on the transfer portal and the NBA Draft Combine. Until then, as always, peace out.